Okay, so we started this lesson saying that North American wildlife management is unique. And it is because of that democratic engagement of the people getting to decide what happens to the wildlife because we're all owners of the wildlife. So we kind of have these 7 pillars that have been kind of boiled down to the foundation stones of um, our wildlife management model. And the first is just that wildlife is a public trust. So the government holds it in trust for the benefit of the people, and the people therefore should have a say in how it is managed. Number 2 is that we eliminated markets for game. So we restrict the sale of meat and animal parts. And in some areas, this has actually led to an overabundance of wildlife because things can get a little out of kilter. The third is the allocation of wildlife by law, meaning the government provides laws that give the framework for how wildlife can be used. And now I want to take a minute here to point out that for most of our wildlife species, it's the states that get to decide the laws. So for all of our animals that are not on the threatened or endangered list and are not marine mammals, of which we have none in Colorado, obviously, it's the states who make those laws. But for the threatened and endangered species and for migratory species, it's the federal government under the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that makes those laws. So both state and federal allocation of wildlife by law. And notice those 2 yellow ones, probably the most important of the first 3. Number 4 is that we have an ethic, really, that says that we should only kill for legitimate purposes. Now, that can get tricky because my version of legitimate might be different than your version of legitimate. Most of our game laws for species that are considered game, like deer, elk, even fur bears, you can only kill them if you're going to consume the meat, and that is a legitimate purpose, or give that meat to somebody else because you can gift the meat. If I kill an animal and leave it, if I kill it just to take a picture with it and leave it, that is a criminal offense. That's called wasting game, and then that can result in a pretty large fine. Now back to, are my reasons different, or what I call legitimate different than what you call legitimate? Well, let's take a common practice that some of you may do. I'm not judging here, but that would be like prairie dog shooting. Just to go out and see how many little prairie dogs you can pick off from a distance. That might be legitimate to you and is legal in some counties. And to other people, that might not be legitimate. So that's kind of an important thing to think about. Number 5 is that we view wildlife as an international resource. We don't say it's only ours. We actually view it as an international resource. Number 6 is that our policy is based on science, or at least it should be. So this gets threatened when we have politicians and politics driving decisions rather than scientists and managers. And obviously, we could go down a big rabbit trail there, but we won't. And number 7, that we have the democracy of hunting. This is really cool. You know that you and I have the ability to buy a license that pays for the wildlife and we can go hunt. Whether or not you hunt and whether or not you agree with hunting, it is remarkable that our country allows anyone who doesn't have a felony offense, anyone to purchase a license rather than just the elite. So this is an important thing to think about, though. For the last few decades and looking into our future, there is a shift away from hunting as a recreational activity. And as we get fewer and fewer people buying licenses and fishing licenses and hunting licenses, then we're going to have less and less money to fund wildlife management. And those license fees pay for much more than game management. They pay for all of the non-game management too, because none of our resources none of our money for state wildlife management comes from general tax funds. Okay, sectors involved in natural resource management. This is so important that you understand these. And if you have to back up and watch this a couple times, please do, because you must understand these 3 sectors involved in natural resource management. We have the public sector, which includes our federal government, so U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service. All of those are federal agencies. And if you work for them, you are part of the public sector of natural resources. We also have, oops, I've got a couple of those there. We also have state level public. So this would be Colorado Parks and Wildlife. This would be Colorado State Forest Service. Those would be managed at the state level. And then the local level, that would be like Larimer County and City of Fort Collins that manage some of our local parks. So of the public sector, you have federal, state, and local employers, if you want to think about it, people whom you may work for. And we'll have a job fair. We have a job fair each year in January. It's really important to know, who are you applying for a job with? If it's the federal government up here, if it's this piece, there's a whole separate process of applying for jobs than if it's one of these two. So it's really important that you know who you're going to work for. So the public sector is often, and really realistically, it's the largest sector of employment for natural resource professionals. We do have a private sector. That would be things like maybe owning a guiding service or raising game birds and people can come pay and hunt on your land. You might have a recreation business like whitewater rafting or a nature photography business. All of those might be private. You may own a logging company. That would be a bigger private company. And then the third is the nonprofit. And this is actually also pretty big, probably second to the public sector. But the nonprofit would be all of these groups. Remember the Boone and Crockett Club being the first, but all of these groups that have formed in order to be able to unify their voice for some particular aspect of natural resource management. So like the Nature Conservancy, they own land, they manage land, but they also inform policy. Wildlands Restoration Volunteers is a local group, a nonprofit group that works to try and rehabilitate lands that have been mismanaged or had some kind of a natural disaster affect them, or maybe are getting overrun with invasive species, a variety of things there. Ducks Unlimited, we have a ton of organizations attached to sportsmen and sportswomen's groups. Ducks Unlimited does a ton to manage wetlands and waterfowl habitat. Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation does a ton to manage elk habitat and big game habitat. Pheasants Forever, upland birds, and the list could go on and on and on and on. And it can be across political boundaries, right? We can go far to the left and far to the right and find a nonprofit group that is associated with some kind of natural resource management or protection. Okay, so to kind of wrap up these three lessons, the main key points here are that we had overexploitation that actually led to conservation, and that was spearheaded by sportsmen's groups. So when people say we shouldn't have sportsmen, we shouldn't have hunters, they need to realize that if without the sportsmen and women, we probably would not have the wildlife diversity that we have today. We had the dawn of wildlife as profession in the 1930s, followed by the era of conservation and the era of environmentalism. And our key laws here would be the Lacey Act, Migratory Treaty Act, Pittman-Robertson Act, Endangered Species Act, and CITES. Our North American model is unique because the people own it, it's protected by law, we base our decisions on science, and it's paid for by the user. And that source of funding is threatened at the moment. And our three sectors of employment are public, private, and nonprofit. Okay, this wraps up our first lesson, kind of going through the history, the legislation, and how we are unique as North American wildlife managers.